Hey everybody, welcome to our Skyland Baptist podcast. This week we'll be talking, continuing our study through the book Counterculture by David Platt. And this week we'll be in chapter 4, which is the gospel and orphans and widows. So we hope that you enjoy this discussion that we have together. I'm Josh Hill. I'm here with John Wiggins and Alex Cowan, and we're just going to dive right in by reading a few scripture verses that pertain to this topic. So I'll kick it over to Alex and let him start us off with that.
Yeah, one of the scriptures here is James chapter 1 verse 27. It says, "Religion that is pure and undefiled before God the Father is this, to visit orphans and widows in their affliction, and to keep oneself unstained from the world."
I've got Galatians chapter 4 verses 4 and 5. "But when the fullness of time had come, God sent forth His Son, born of woman, born under the law, to redeem those who were under the law, so that we might receive adoption as sons." A lot of great words, keywords there. John?
The psalmist, Psalm 65, verse 5 and 6. "Father to the fatherless, a defender of widows, is God in His holy dwelling. God set the lonely in families." So all three of those kind of, at least in some way, related to the topic of orphans and widows. As we think about this topic, first thing that we see in the book is that Platt talks about is really kind of connecting this with his own life and his desire to adopt children and so forth, and how God's worked in his heart to do so. And so he spends a lot of time talking about that on the front end, and helps kind of give a glimpse into how God changed his heart in some ways in this area. Mm-hmm. I don't think any of us kind of have a story necessarily of how we have adopted a child per se, but we obviously seen that in our church family. We have examples of that in our church family, and I know we've seen it, how God has worked in powerful ways to display this picture of the gospel, how God adopts us into His family in real ways in our own lives.
We've spent several of these. Well, I say several. We've only done 3 before this, but 2 out of the 3 we've done before this on this book have been kind of controversial topics, and we've gotten to this chapter and this shouldn't be controversial to anybody. The church should take care of widows and orphans. In James it talks about that being pure and undefiled religion. Right? We'll get into that in a little bit, but it's nice to just be able to come together and have a totally and completely unified mind on yes, this is the right thing to do. This is how we're supposed to do it.
And it's also one of the only ones where we're in step with American secular culture. Yeah. You could go to almost anyone in the American culture and say, should we care for widows and orphans? And they'd say, of course.
Yeah. Is adoption a good thing?
Yes. So, whereas last week when we were talking about abortion, we could go to somebody in the secular American culture and they'd have a completely different viewpoint on abortion, and there'd be conflict there in that. So this is one where there is widespread approval of to be on the same page.
Yeah, maybe where our culture in America and the Christian culture intersect a little bit.
Yeah. 153 million children live as orphans, meaning that they have lost at least one parent. 18 million children have lost both parents. That's not even counting, the areas of where you see children who are orphaned, basically in the streets or in institutions, and yet do not have that mother and father there. So, pretty amazing to think about those kind of numbers when you talk about. And one of the things Platt does is he's very intentional here to say, hey, look, those are just numbers until they're faces, and he's spot on, right? It's easy to forget a number after you read a paragraph or hear a statistic, but it's different when you know a face of a person, a child, who who doesn't have those arms around them, you know, on a nightly basis.
Especially when the numbers are that big, right? You know, we kind of convince ourselves that if a number is big enough, it must be imaginary, right? So like the national debt, it's like $22 trillion. That's not real. Who knows what that number is? So, you know, you hear 150 million orphans, you go, well, that's not real. It's just a big number. You know? And it might be real, but you're right. I mean, and he's right. It's easy to say, oh, we need to do something about 150 million orphans. It's harder to look an orphan in the face and say, I can't take care of you. Like, that's nearly impossible to do, as it should be, you know? We ought to be taking care of people.
So God's designed His church to care for the brokenness of the world. This huge problem. That's why there's this great commission to go and share the gospel and plant churches in communities, because then there's going to be believers there who can take the burden upon themselves to care for the widows and orphans. That's why God's called us to do this. He doesn't just call us to do it because it's a rule that we have to follow. Oh, we have to go and visit with the widows and orphans. But it's because it's God's way of blessing the world. It's through the church.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Yeah. I love what he said about the passage that I think you read, which is true religion, you know. And he kind of summarized it as being basically true religion being to be family to those who have lost their family. And that's spot on. That takes into account the widow who's lost her husband and the orphan who's lost their father, mother, or both. And man, it's a great summary word, I think, for that verse, you know. And you're right, like we know that if we know the gospel, we have, I mean, we can't not care for those who are fatherless, you know, because we were at one point, you know, we were
strangers with no hope.
Yeah,
Right.
and in need of a God to be our Father. And I mean, we see that at the end of the chapter, right? When we see that he not only had the resources but he had the resolve to move and rescue us in our sinful place and make us children of God.
Intentional intervention. He moved on our behalf.
But why? Why do we have to look after widows? I know God tells us to do it, but God tells us to do it for a reason. Like, why?
I mean, like, why does he call us?
Why does he call us to do it?
Is this rhetorical, or are you going to answer?
No,
I was like,
question point. Because
I was waiting for him to answer.
In biblical society,
Tear in the headlights.
I was teeing myself up here to answer the question. In this biblical culture that we read of, there was no social security system. For women to lose her husband would have been losing the breadwinner for the family. It would have been protection. It would have been income to the family. And a widow was one of the most helpless people in society. So when Jesus talks about the widow's mite, it was such a big deal, because if there was anyone in the temple that day who could have done with keeping their mite, it would have been the widow. And yeah, these are the most helpless people in society, and God's saying, well, we're going to care. Who's going to care for them? It's going to be my people who care for them, and we're going to be there for each other in times of need.
Yeah, I think, and vulnerable people, I think the way to say that, and two, I think significantly that you know, he gives the Boaz story, you know, and lays it out and talks about how God established within His people a framework for caring for orphans and widows, right? And that the Israelite people would be unique in this, like they would do this really, really well, you know, and kind of gives parameters so that would be the case, you know. And we look at those parameters and we're like, ooh, that's really weird. You know, you think about, you know, your brother's wife, if sometimes your brother, and taking her in as your own. I mean, that's weird, you know. But
in this culture, it was honourable.
Yes,
you would be seen as a good brother, for doing that. And even just the weird rules of their society. For instance, Boaz, that they leave the wheat or the barley that falls on the floor to be gleaned by the widows and the orphans and those who can't eat. So they even have rules of how you collect your crops. So there's a way for widows to be taken care of.
Right. Stuff that's rightfully yours has been prescribed by God as, hey, leave this for other people.
Right. Yeah. So that's why Ruth's there. She's picking the scraps off the floor, because God's even designed a way of them being able to be given food.
Yeah.
That whole Boaz story, and I'm sure you're going to get into that too. You probably have a plan for that, not just totally throwing it off
no,
the way it works. But the way that he lays that out in the sense of having this responsibility as the kinsman redeemer, having the resources, and having the resolve.
Yeah.
And, you know, the fact that all three of those things had to come together in the perfect way in order to make that happen. But even just going back into the story, you know, farther into shame culture and how so much of that is seen in this context of this story, and how, you know, Ruth's mother-in-law, Naomi, is dealing with... Was it Naomi? Mm-hmm. Okay, great. I'm glad I got that right. Naomi is, you know, was married, lost her husband, lost her sons. Her sons had married Moabite women who God had said were cursed into the 10th generation for leading the Israelites astray way, way, way back. You know, you've channeled back even to how the Moabites came into being. It was through an incestuous relationship with Lot and his daughter. I mean, so many crazy, shameful things, potential. And we see that the bloodline of not only the most famous king in Israel as a nation, but the bloodline of Jesus coming out of that because of the kinsman-redeemer relationship that Boaz established. That's just the coolest thing ever.
And there's another word that Platt talks about. He quotes scripture here from Deuteronomy 10, 17 through 18. He says, talking of God as a father to the fatherless, a defender of widows. In Exodus 22, he says, you shall not mistreat any widow or fatherless child. Isaiah 1:17 talks about bringing justice to the fatherless. And, you know, you've got widows and you've got orphans, but you've also got fatherless homes that seem to be a huge problem and a huge concern to God. And children who are growing up in fatherless households. And last week we talked about the breakdown of the family in our country, and a lot of the things the byproducts being abortion that sadly came from that. You know, fatherlessness is a problem in our society, and it's something that we need to be praying about, and you know, praying for young men that they can grow up to be committed husbands and fathers.
Yeah, over a third of the children in America, what the statistic was here was that they don't have at least one parent. You know, and you know. I don't think any of us can relate to that in any kind of sympathetic way, in the sense that we've been there and are experiencing anything similar to that. We both have, I think all three have parents, you know, that both a mom and a dad in our homes, you know, growing up. And I tell you, like, you know, having done youth ministry for years, you know, and seeing the impact of not having a father or a mother in the home and how that impacts a child, it's massive impact, you know. I mean, and you're right, you know, fatherlessness. You know, a friend who came not long ago and spoke to our men for breakfast, who does ministry to try to help engage men to be fathers where fathers are not in the lives of children in the church, you know. And I think that's a great idea and concept in ministry. In the sense that, you know, Christian men ought to be on the lookout for children in the church, and to be able to say, hey, how can I come alongside and be an encouragement to this young man? I've seen the hurt that a boy can have, you know, specifically boys. I guess is what I'm thinking about, because I have the experience to go on with that. But you know, how that affects them in terms of, you know, not having a father on Father's Day or whatever, you know.
But yeah, I just wanted to point that out. That was just one word that kept coming up there in a certain section. He was talking about the fatherless. Then we also see, we were speaking earlier about in Acts chapter 7, where we see...
Chapter 6,
chapter 6, sorry. Where we see the men called to serve. And it's because they were not able to do their job in distributing the bread to the widows. So it shows you how important and the pride of place in their ministry serving the widows was, that it was something that they were not willing to neglect.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. And such an important responsibility that the apostles, the 12, brought together the full number of the disciples, it says, and, pick out from among you 7 men of good repute, full of the Spirit and of wisdom, whom we will appoint to this duty. They're picking out 7 top-tier, cream-of-the-crop guys to be like, this is your responsibility. It's so important. It's so important that we want you to devote yourselves to this thing and do this thing super well.
Yeah. And that's why, even in the church today, we must care for the widows in our congregation well.
Mm-hmm.
It's a lot more common in our society, in our congregations, to have widows than orphans. That's why we need to make sure we're connecting with them, because it's lonely, making sure they've got their needs taken care of. And thankfully, I think in Skyland Baptist Church, that happens mostly through our community groups. That if someone is to lose their husband, they've got a community group that can rally around them and can be there with them, be companion for them, care for them, and let us know if there's any needs on top of that.
And the deacons do a good job of standing in the gap, moving in where needs take place, especially, needs as far as like if something's going wrong with the house. The men's ministry jumps in a whole lot of times. They built a deck, was it last year?
A ramp, yeah.
A ramp, yeah.
For
Charlotte
and Betty Lewis.
Or George and Betty.
Yeah, Charlotte too. I'm sorry. You're right.
And we've done so many things, just to take care of so many people. But it's amazing, especially after the last year that we've had, where you're not able to see people's faces and people are terrified. And, we had, even in a couple of situations, we were doing CDs for people so they'd be able to hear, the service on Sunday mornings, and they wouldn't accept a CD player. They didn't have a CD player in the house, and they were too afraid to take the CD player from us. It's amazing just how we were able to minister to people with phone calls. You could, half of the time, especially when we were closed up, I would, for that month-long period, the phone calls I would make, I'd be lucky to get through 4 or 5 in a day, because you end up just talking to somebody for an hour.
Yeah. Yeah, I think, kind of a thought to sort of move us to a close would be, I think, to ask a question about, so hey, what are we doing? What should we do? And those are good things. I mean, I think those are practical things. Community group plays a part in care for the widows. Deacons play a part in serving widows. The deacons are teachers of community groups that serve widows, and so obviously that makes sense. And our men's ministry does projects for our widows at times when they need things done in their home and so forth, and that happens. Our deacons do too. We have a few deacons who will go to homes of some of our women to help them with some specific things. What about orphans? Orphans, we support the Alabama Baptist Children's Home, and we gave significantly this past year, more than we ever have that I'm aware of, this past year to the Alabama Baptist Children's Home. And so, I think that's one of the great things we do as a church in terms of our giving is to really impact the lives of children right where they are. And
I've got some numbers here from this is their report from last year, and in their Decatur office they had 5 adoptions, 8 professions of faith, and they reunified 41 children to their families. In Oxford office they had 4 adoptions and 17 reunifications. In Birmingham, 13 adoptions, 41 unifications. In Auburn they had 2 adoptions, 10 reunifications. In Mobile they had 7 adoptions and 39 reunifications. In Montgomery they had 1 adoption and 15 reunifications. And in Dothan, Alabama, 7 adoptions and 36 reunifications. So all across the state, through what we give, we have children being adopted into a new family, or children who are at risk being reunified with their parents in a healthy way, which is amazing. And when we talk about cooperation, and one of the reasons why we're Southern Baptist is because there's some things we can't do on our own. We couldn't do this on our own.
No way.
This takes serious money to be able to hire social workers and kids education professionals and all of these processes. And it takes professional people to do this. And we're thankful that those people serve the Alabama Baptist Children Home. We're thankful that we can work with all these thousands of Alabama Baptist churches to do this.
And another way that we've been very encouraging of our congregation to take parting in the past is respite care through the foster care system.
Yeah.
You know, it's, you know, there are a few requirements, a few things you have to go through to be able to get set up with that. But your home could be the difference between a child spending a night in an office on a cot or spending a night in bed with snacks surrounded by, you know, comfortable people.
Yeah,
You know?
absolutely. You know, we did that. I remember a while back we had some people come from a one of our foster organizations in Birmingham came, and uniquely Christian organization, and so they came and shared a little about those, and we were a place where people came to learn about that. We also help out through. We used to do this. I hadn't done it because of COVID, I guess, last year, but we would be a place where we would do kind of like a parent night out. We would do it for foster parents, and we did that a couple of times in the past, and it's a great ministry. We partner with other Southern Baptist churches to do that, and a great ministry to help out families who are fostering or adoptive parents to have some time for themselves, you know, to encourage their relationship, you know, as mom and dad. So that they can be the parents.
And many children in our Treehouse Club, you know, are also dealing with various levels of, you know, those sorts of familial situations. So, you know, there are some tangible ways for people in our church to get involved and to be a steady presence in the life of a child.
Another great way is through Compassion International. I mean, I don't know if you guys have a child, but my family, we have a child that we sponsor, and I think it's a great way to be a part of caring for an orphan and really adopting them in, honestly, to your family in a real way. And we're a part of that, and our kids kind of get to be involved in that on some level through writing letters and so forth. But that's another great way, and that's mentioned kind of the last part of the chapter there. There's some great ways. I think it's incredible what Platt talks about in his book here, though. When you talk about having a desire to end the foster care work in your city.
That was crazy, yeah. So, you know, in case you missed that in the chapter, he went to their local DHR, their county DHR, and was like, how many families would it take to get rid of all, you know, to reunite or to have a place for all of the children currently in the foster care system in the county? And the person said 150. It would be an actual miracle. And then they preached on it that Sunday, and they had 160 families come forward. Like, that meant that there was a waiting list to give foster kids to parents. That's unbelievable. Like, parents were on the waiting list. That's, you know, like Platt said, it was a miracle of God. You know, the Spirit of God moving into a particular situation and moving on the hearts of people to meet a need. But if you're listening to this podcast and you want to get involved in any of these ways that we've mentioned, or if you have an idea of how we can get involved, or you may have another idea, we'd love to talk to you. We want to help you get connected. That's part of our mission as your pastors, is to help you see Jesus, be in community, and care for others. And you know, what we're talking about is a combination of all of those things. All important things. Do you have anything else that we need to?
I don't. I think we covered it pretty well there. I don't. You know, like was said, you know, it's a controversial issue. You know, like Scripture's pretty clear. God has a heart for widows and orphans, and we don't really have we also ought to have a heart for them as well. And so yeah. I mean, if you can't practically point to significant ways where you're a part of ministry in terms of widows and orphans, man, I would say that's problematic in light of calling yourself a Christ follower, to not have the heart of God, because He clearly has a heart for widows and orphans. So,
yeah. Well, thanks again for joining us this week. We really appreciate it. Make sure that if you listen to this, you share it with your friends. Hopefully it can be a blessing to them. As always, if you have any questions about anything we've talked about, either today or over the last couple of weeks, or if you've read ahead and you want us to cover something in maybe another podcast that's coming up soon, we'd love to hear from you. Just send one of us an email, and hopefully we will get to see you soon. But know that until that time comes, we love you and we're praying for you.